Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am John Spencer. I'm the interim director of the Walter and Mary Tuohy Chair of Interreligious Studies and a member of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at John Carroll University. On behalf of the university and the Tuohy Chair, we would first like to welcome you to John Carroll University and to this lecture this evening. This evening, I want to spend a few moments introducing both the lecture series and our lecture to you. This lecture series is entitled Exploring Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. This is this year's edition of the Walter and Mary Tuohy Lectures in Interreligious Studies. These lectures are supported by a fund provided by Walter and Mary Tuohy. Mr. Tuohy was the Chief Executive Officer of Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, the C&O. And given his interests in interreligious studies, he and his wife established this chair in 1966. This makes the Tuohy Chair one of the oldest chairs of ecumenical studies in American universities. We here at John Carroll University are both very grateful to Walter and Mary Tuohy for the generosity and very privileged to carry on the practice of engaging different religious traditions through thoughtful, intellectual, and respectful conversations. This evening's lecture will continue that practice. Our lecture tonight, and for the next two nights, is Dr. Scott Alexander. Dr. Alexander is Associate Professor of Islam and the Director of the program in Catholic Muslim Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. Dr. Alexander began his academic career at Harvard University, where he graduated magna cum laude with a BA in Comparative Study of Religion. From there, he went to Columbia University in New York City, where he received an MA and MPhil, both with distinction. He continued his studies at Columbia, graduating with a PhD in the history of religions, concentrating on Islamic studies. His dissertation was titled Hidden in the Books, a biobibliography and religious authority in the works of an 11th century Shiite jurist and theologian. Perhaps he'll tell us what the name of that gentleman was. After his doctoral studies, Dr. Alexander taught for several years at Indiana University in Bloomington before moving to his current position at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He has held a number of positions on boards, including the advisory board of the Martin Marty Center for Advanced Study of Religion at the University of Chicago. He's on the board of Monastic Interreligious Dialogue, the Catholic Association of Directors of Ecumenical and Interreligious Officers, and the Niagara Foundation, a foundation for promoting Turkish-American relations. Dr. Alexander has a number of publications with a wide range of focuses, from Christian hospitality and pastoral practices from a Roman Catholic perspective, to knowing and loving our neighbors and of other faiths, to Hagar as an Abrahamic symbol of freedom from oppression, and patience and trust in the Encyclopedia of the Quran. He is currently working on a book titled, tentatively, The Race to Goodness, an End to Triumphalism in the Christian-Muslim Relations. I'm sure we'll hear some of Scott's thought on this topic this evening in the next couple of lectures. He has an active speaking schedule with lectures in such diverse places as Doha, Qatar, Tampa, Florida, Scottsdale, Arizona, Antalya, Turkey, Durban, South Africa, and Hong Kong. I even learned this afternoon that he has Sicilian ancestry to go with us as we were looking at the Sicilian exhibit at the museum this afternoon. So we're very privileged that Dr. Alexander makes a stop in Cleveland for us, and I'm anticipating a series of very interesting lectures on Muslim-Christian relations. The lecture this evening is titled Islam 2.0, The Messengers of God and the Muslim in us all. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Alexander.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
My mic is on, I think. Yes, well, it's on. Okay, great. I'll start by saying Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Tusi. That's the answer to Professor Spencer's question about the 11th century Shiite jurist and theologian that was the focus of my dissertation. I'm sure you all know who he is. That was a joke. It's interesting that the I had the privilege just yesterday of going to the Sunday Vigil Mass at the Church of the Holy Rosary in Little Italy, accompanied by a newfound Muslim friend of mine from the Hizmet movement here in Cleveland. And the themes of the readings for the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time, both from 2 Kings and Luke 17, have to do with lepers who are healed by the God of Israel and who express gratitude for their healing. And the two lepers that express gratitude are strangers. They're strangers to Israel. They're not Israelites. And they've come to know the mercy and goodness of the God of Israel, a mercy and goodness which extends so broadly that it touches even their lives. Gratitude to God and to one another is one of those values that strongly connects people from a wide variety of religious traditions, especially Christians and Muslims. There's a famous hadith, a report of one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, which reads in Arabic, "Man la yashkuru nas, la yashkuru Allah." It basically means the one who does not thank her or his fellow human beings cannot thank God. And so I cannot exercise my gratitude to God for the great blessing of and great privilege of being the Tuohy lecturer and being here in Cleveland at John Carroll for the next few days without thanking the people that have made this possible. So first and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to Walter and Mary Tuohy, whose generosity and insight into the importance of dialogue, not only for the Catholic Church, but for the world, not only for the internal life of the Church, not only for the internal life of the Christian tradition, but for the entire human family, people who obviously had a profound sense of that importance. I also want to thank Provost John Day. I want to thank the Chair of Theology and Religious Studies, Professor Sheila McGinn, and offer my very special thanks, of course, to Professor John Spencer, who is the interim director of the Tuohy Chair, and the amazing Kathy Merhar. I don't know if Kathy is here. She's one of those people that works behind the scenes to make everything possible, and has a lot of responsibility and doesn't necessarily get much glory. But Kathy, I'm very thankful to you, as we all are, for helping to make this possible. I also want to thank my dear friend, Dr. Zeki Saritoprak, who has been my colleague for many, many years, my mentor, my teacher in many ways. I know that it was his influence that had something to do with my being here today, and I'm very grateful to him. And finally, I really want to thank each and every one of you for giving of your time. You know, on this Sunday evening, you could all be doing other things, but you're coming here. Some of you may be here under some obligation that some professor has kind of twisted your arm to be here. So for those of you that are here under some obligation, I hope I can fulfill my responsibility to make this as pleasant and enriching an experience as possible, inshallah, which is Arabic for saying God willing. I'm going to use my little pointer and move around a bit. Our cameraman told us that it wouldn't be a problem if I moved around, and at a later hour it tends to make me be able to stay awake a little better and maybe feel more connected with you if I don't have to stand behind the podium. Why the title Islam 2.0? Where does that come from? Well, in a way, this is a lecture that I like to give to folks who may not have any prior background in Islamic studies whatsoever. So in a way, it's kind of an introductory lecture. So why not call it Islam 1.0? Well, that's because your general Islam 1.0 focuses on the 5 pillars of Islam. One of the neat things about the Islamic tradition is that there are 5 elements of practice that have been identified as core to Muslim identity and exist at the center of the ibadat, the acts of worship and service to God that make Muslims who they are. And so your standard introduction to Islam walks people through the 5 pillars of Islam. The thing is, you can get information a la Islam 1.0 in a lot of different places. Information about the 5 pillars of Islam. I've always been reluctant to sort of develop a talk trying to introduce people to the Islamic tradition if they have no prior background that focuses on something they can get anywhere. So I thought, what did I learn about Islam about 3 years into my study of Islam that I kind of wished I had known at the outset? Even though it was kind of enjoyable not learning about it until about 3 or 4 years in. And maybe I can sort of take that and put it into sort of a kind of introductory framework. And that's what I'm trying to do here with you this evening. The subtitle gives you a sense of exactly what I'm going to focus on in this Islam 2.0. The messengers of God and the Muslim in us all. Now I happen to know from overhearing a conversation that there is a perspicacious gentleman sitting here to my right who asked a question about why that M in Muslim is lowercase. Is that a typo? I make all kinds of typos when I'm making PowerPoint presentations. Even when I think I'm reviewing them for important, august lectures like the Tuohy lectures, I oftentimes don't catch my mistakes. But I assure you, the lowercase M in Muslim is deliberate. So normally that would be a typo because Muslim is a proper noun. But it's not only a proper noun. And we'll get to what that has to do with what I want to share with you as we move through the presentation. Just wanted to point one thing out. I've got today's date in 3 different traditions. The Jewish calendar, the standard Western Gregorian calendar, which sometimes would be identified as Christian calendar, and the Islamic calendar. It's the 8th of Dhul Hijjah, the 8th day of the last month of the Muslim year, 1434. That means in 2 days, the Muslim community will be celebrating one of the 2 great festivals of the Muslim religious calendar, the Eid al-Adha, or in Turkish, Kurban Bayramı. So it's the festival where Muslims around the world get to express solidarity with the pilgrims on Hajj in Mecca and its environs right now, but also solidarity with their ancestor in faith, Abraham, because it commemorates the sacrifice of the ram in the thicket. And it's a religious act which serves to unite Muslims in the common notion that they have an obligation to serve the poorest among them, because the meat of the sacrifice is to go to those who are poor and indigent and who go without. I was just in Turkey, and people are, collecting money and donations so that sacrifices of meat, but also other necessities for life, can be sent to a number of different, communities on the African continent. And so it was wonderful to see people prepare for their holy day with such a consciousness of their obligation to serve the poor. So let's just keep in mind that our Muslim sisters and brothers are getting ready to celebrate a very important festival in just a couple of days. Eid Mubarak to all my Muslim sisters and brothers who are here. The subtitle, The Messengers of God and the Muslim in Us All, has to do with sort of 2 windows on Islam, or on the Quranic worldview, if you will, that I'm going to attempt to open in this Islam 2.0 presentation. Now, what are these 2 windows? These are not 2 windows on Islam. These might be called 2 Islamic windows. These are windows of Al-Aqsa Mosque, Masjid Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, on Al-Haram Sharif. The 2 windows, metaphorical windows, that I want to try to open in this presentation are, 1, the window of prophetology. That is, what is the Islamic version of the history of God's interaction with humanity. Of course, we're not going to get, into a sort of, high-powered academic exploration of these things. It would take, weeks and weeks to sort of unpack the richness and complexity of what's actually, what actually we're looking at when we're looking for these two windows. But we're just going to take a brief look and try to get a kind of summative view. So the window of prophetology, trying to get a general sense of what Islam teaches about the history of God's interaction with humanity. The second window is what I'm calling the window of theological anthropology. The window of theological anthropology. Anthropology in the academy is the study of what it means to be human, how humans kind of organize themselves socially, et cetera, et cetera. Theological anthropology really has to do with what various theological traditions teach about what it means to be human or the nature of the human person. So the window of theological anthropology I'd like to try to open here is the window that gives us some access to what Islam teaches about the religious nature of the human person. So the history of God's interaction with humanity and the religious nature of the human person. And these are kind of linked. And my contention in the presentation will be that if we understand what we're looking at through these two windows, not only will we have a good foundation for further study of Islamic theology, but we'll also have, especially if we understand the interplay of these two, we'll also have a rough idea of how Islam understands itself, if we can talk about a tradition as diverse and complex as Islam having self-understanding, how Islam understands itself vis-a-vis the other two so-called Abrahamic traditions, namely Judaism and Christianity. So I'm trying to intuit that might be a question that would interest an audience such as you. So let's open up the first window, the window of prophetology, and see what we see. Where I want to start, I said this is not a lecture on the 5 pillars of Islam, but if you're going to open up the window of prophetology, you have to look at the first pillar of Islam. The first pillar of Islam is known in Arabic as the Shahada. This is a root that comes from a root meaning to testify or to give witness. And it is actually this bifold testimony of faith, which I would offer as the cornerstone of Islamic prophetology. So it's a bipartite or bifold formula, 2 parts. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. And the translation is roughly of the first part. I testify that there is no God but Allah, God. Now notice I've got Allah/God. I want to just pause here for a footnote about this word Allah. Many people think this is the Muslim God, as opposed to the Christian God or the Jewish God. Now, oftentimes people's thinking in this regard has to do with their own particular theological commitments, and I'm not going to argue with that. From the magisterial Roman Catholic position, Allah is not the God of the Muslims as opposed to the God of Jews and Christians, but Allah is the one true God. In part, I like to think, and I like to think Archbishop Michael Fitzgerald, who was here earlier, would agree with me on this, that the reason why the Catholic tradition so easily identifies the God of the Quran with the God of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is because it's very much aware that Arab Christians refer to God as Allah. Why? Because it's the Arabic word for God. It's the Arabic word for God with a capital G. Not exclusively the Muslim word for God or the Muslim name for God. It comes from most likely etymologically from a contraction of al-ilah, the God, which is an almost direct equivalent of ho theos in Greek. which in the Septuagint of the New Testament is what gets translated into English as God with a capital G, the God, God with a capital G, or Dieu in French, or Gott in German, or Dios in Spanish, etc., etc. So Allah is the Arabic word for God. If you look at an Arabic translation of the New Testament, every time the word Hotheos, the God, appears in the Greek, Allah appears in the Arabic. All right? But it is important to recognize that from the Muslim perspective, Allah is God's favorite name for God's self. Because it's the most recurrent name for God in the Holy Quran, and since as Muslims believe the Quran is the very word of God, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, then God must like the name Allah the best. And there's lots of Muslim theological reflection as to why that is, because it's a word that can't be pluralized, it's a word that has no gender, etc. And so it emphasizes this very important notion of Tawheed Allah, the unity and partnerlessness of God, which is really at the heart of Muslim theology. I testify there's no God but Allah, God. Well, how is this the cornerstone of Islamic prophetology, you might be asking? I mean, there are many of us in this room who would not consider themselves Muslim with a capital M. Many Christians, many Jews, many people of other faith traditions perhaps, who would find no problem with testifying, witnessing that there is no God but the one God, Allah. Well, this is the universal piece of the Shahada, of the testimony of faith, where this testimony becomes the cornerstone of Islamic prophetology is as it moves from the radically universal to the radically particular. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of God. What's happening here is that this witness to the oneness of the single creator of the universe is somehow intimately and inextricably tied to the life of a time-bound human being who has a name, who was born in the late 6th century of the Common Era, around 570 CE, and who died in 632 CE. Somehow the life of this bounded, time-bound, place-bound human being is inextricably linked to the boundless, infinite God of all the universe. This is where we have the cornerstone of Islamic prophetology. It all centers on this particular linkage. How knowledge of and devotion to the one God is linked to the existence of this one historical personage. So to understand Islamic prophetology, we start with this cornerstone in the Shahada, in the testimony of faith, but we now have to move to learning a little bit about who this individual was. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. This little S here stands for that phrase I just said in Arabic, which roughly translates, may God bless him and give him peace. The Quran commands its hearers, all humanity, that when they mention the names of the prophets and messengers of God, they call down God's blessings upon those individuals. And there's a special blessing that's used for the Prophet Muhammad. What looks like a little maze here is actually not a maze. As many of you know, there is a general, prohibition, I guess, against the figural representation of any of the prophets, including the Prophet Muhammad. I say general because it's not absolute. There are instances of the figural representation of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in various Islamic artistic traditions. But by and large, because of the fear of idolatry and other things, the prophets are not represented figurally. But calligraphy, because Islam is so focused on the revelation of the word of the Quran, calligraphy is, in a sense, the highest graphic religious art form. And so this is the name of Muhammad. 4 times. This is the, well, we start here because this is where it's facing us head on. The initial meme, and then the next ha, the H, and then the 2 other M's that are double, and the final D. And it just turns 1/4 time each time. So it says Muhammad, 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 Muhammad. Now, the thing that I want us to focus on in terms of who Muhammad ibn Abdullah is in the context of Islamic prophetology is the fact that he's understood to be the last messenger of God. This lastness is very important. It's not just a temporal distinction. It has a lot of significance in terms of Islamic prophetology, in terms of what Islam wants to teach about the history of God's interaction with humanity. So there are lots of stories about the life of the Prophet Muhammad that one could tell, that I would love to tell and share with you. In the interest of time, I'm just picking perhaps the one most pivotal one, and that is the event on Nur, what comes to be called the Mountain of Light. Here is a late medieval miniature, and his example of the figural representation of the Prophet Muhammad, by the way, being visited by a celestial being, was none other than the angel Gabriel. He's in the cave of Hira on the Mountain of Light outside of his native Mecca. You'll notice that there's a veil over the Prophet's face, so even though he's figurally represented here, you don't see the facial features. The other thing to recognize is that while these artistic traditions of the figural representation of the Prophet exist, they are never used in a cultic context. They're never used in a religious context. These are usually illuminated literary manuscripts. But it's not as if the figural depiction of the Prophet doesn't exist. The story of the event on the Mountain of Light is that, well, Muhammad was something of a religious misfit in his own day. He was very well respected as a man of his word, very upright, very trustworthy. He had the laqab or the nickname of Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. But I think he appeared to his fellow pagan Arabs to be a Jewish or Christian wannabe. He wasn't a Jew or a Christian, but he seemed to have the same fascination for the one God that Jews and Christians have. Perhaps many pagan Arabs understood there to be one parent God of all the various deities that they had cultic relationships with, but because that parent God was so high and so distant from the sublunar realm, it just didn't make much sense to try to have any relationship with this God. But there's plenty of evidence that Muhammad probably wasn't very convinced that these other deities had much value, and he wanted to connect with this high deity, Al-Ilah, or Allah. So he did what Christians and Jews, had reputations for doing, fasting and praying in solitude. He would go to this cave, Hira, on this mountain outside his native Mecca for long periods of time, fasting and praying. And in one of these instances, a mysterious visitor appeals to him, who is later identified as the angel Gabriel, Jibreel. And according to Muhammad's own account, the visitor appears to him and has something in its hand. I'm going to say it because, as you know, angels are not gendered. So, I will just say it for now. The angel has something in its hand, and there's a cloth over it with some brocade writing. And the angel approaches Muhammad and says simply one word to him: Iqra, read or recite. Same word in Arabic. And Muhammad expresses the tradition about himself, which is that as smart a man as he was unlettered. He lived in largely an oral culture where writing wasn't that important, and so he had no skills at reading or writing. So he told the angelic visitor, I can't read, I can't recite it. The angelic visitor is not taking no for an answer. Again, read, recite. The Prophet says the same thing. A third time, the prophet says the angel is taking this object and pressing it against his breast, such that he feels like his life breath is going to be squeezed out of him, and then the words come upon his heart. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. Recite the name of your nurturing sustainer who created human beings from a blood clot. Recite, for your nurturing sustainer is most generous, who taught human beings by the pen, taught them what they did not know. This recitation in Arabic Quran, with a little Q, was the first in a series of recitations that the Prophet Muhammad would receive over a 22-year period, from that point, roughly at around the year 610, until he died in 632. And basically what we know as the Quran today, Muslims believe to be a collection of those recitations that Muhammad received from the angel Gabriel. Recite the revelation of the Quran. All right, so that's a little bit about this event in the life of this individual historical Arabian living in the late 6th and early 7th century. An event that, however it's interpreted, changed his life radically and undeniably changed the history of the world. Now, what does this have to do with Islamic prophetology? Well, it has to do with how Muhammad grew to understand himself. Notice that in that revelation, God is saying to the angel, your nurturing sustainer who taught by the pen, taught human beings what they did not know. It's using the perfect tense in Arabic. It means that something is being accomplished in the present in that regard. There is a teaching now going on that is being fulfilled and accomplished in the prophet's hearing. But also, it means that it's been done in the past too. This isn't the first time that God has tried to communicate something to humanity by choosing a very special emissary. So, Muhammad has a prophetic genealogy. And we're going to try to learn a little bit about this genealogy by picturing it. You all have a handout with a little image on it. This is a folk motif called Shajaratul Anbiya, the tree of the prophets. And as you see, there's a tree, and it's got little what I call flowers with the petals on them, right? And it's got little 5-pointed flowers, which I'll just call blossoms. And in the middle of all these flowers and blossoms is Arabic writing. Those are the names of individuals, many of whom would be familiar to those who know the biblical tradition. And in the box below the image is a little key that corresponds by number with the little flowers and blossoms on the tree. So you can kind of follow along. When we move to the next slide, and you see that image in living color. I want you to note two things, to take away two things from this image in terms of my attempt to open this window on Islamic prophetology. So I explain what that is. The first is that Muhammad is depicted as sprouting from the same roots as all of these other figures who are named on that tree. He is depicted as a member of the fraternity of prophets and messengers of God. I say fraternity, by the way, just as a footnote, because the vast bulk of the names of the prophets who are known, and by the way, the numbers of prophets have been estimated to be, by some estimations, over 350,000, which is just a way of saying scads and scads and scads and scads. There was an medieval Andalusian Muslim scholar by the name of Ibn Hazm who claimed that there is sufficient evidence that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a prophet. We won't get into that, but it's interesting to know that there has been a minority tradition, never accepted as mainstream, that there are female prophets, and that Mary was one of them. Anyway, it's largely thought of as a fraternity. And Muhammad is understood to be a member of this fraternity. He is not, in other words, as a prophet and messenger of God, he's not unique. But he has a very special role to play. He may not be unique, but he has a unique role to play as a member of this fraternity. And that role is connected with the fact that he's the last, and because he's the last in a way, he's the greatest prophet and messenger. He is the seal or apex of prophetic history. Let's take a look at what these two things might actually mean. So here's the image in color. At the bottom of the image, at the bottom of the tree, you have a scroll with a hadith, report of one of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, "An-nas banu Adam wa Adam khuliqa min turab," which translates roughly, humanity are the sons and daughters of Adam, and Adam was created from the dust. You've heard this before. Those of you that are familiar with the biblical tradition. And when we start at the first flower on the tree, it's the flower of none other than Adam. Okay? The first prophet and messenger of God. And then we get Idris or Enoch, Noah, Ibrahim or Abraham, Saleh and Hud. These are two Arabian prophets who, as far as we know, are not attested in the biblical tradition. Lut, that would be Lot. Here's Ibrahim. Ibrahim's two sons, the eldest Ismail, and the younger Ishaq. Ismail by his union with Hajar, or Hagar, and Ishaq by his union with Sarah. Now you notice there's only one prophet and messenger descended from the line of Ismail, and we'll get to him shortly. But here through Ishaq, you get Yaqub, Jacob, or Israel, all the sons of Israel, including Joseph, who was a prophet and messenger of God in the Islamic tradition. Here's Job and Ezekiel. If we follow through the line of Lawi or Levi, you get actually Harun or Aaron, and you get Moses, as well as Elisha and Elijah. If you follow through the line of Yehuda or Judah, you get Dawood or David. You get Sulaiman ibn Dawood, Solomon the son of David. Jonah is over here, by the way. You get Zechariah, the father of Yahya, or Yahya the son of Zechariah. Yahya is the baptizer, John the Baptist, the son of Zechariah, of New Testament fame, also descended from Solomon. Isa, or Jesus. Muslims would say, alayhi salam, peace be upon them all, responding to that Quranic commandment I alluded to earlier. Here, in this distinctive flower on the right-hand side, kind of in a unique position, but still very much connected to the rest of the tree, is Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Peace and blessings be upon him. Now, a few things are interesting, right? Height in this image indicates the passage of time. Right? Muhammad lives long after Jesus, but his flower is not higher than Jesus. You could say, but wait a minute, it might be higher than Jesus. It might be just farther away in the background. So like the sun is certainly higher than this flower on this tree, it just from this perspective it doesn't look like it is. But perspective is important. And I think this ambiguity is deliberate because what the image is trying to do is trying to hold in creative tension the fraternity and equality that the Quran teaches all prophets have. There's a very famous verse of the Quran that says, God says, we don't distinguish among them. They're all exemplars for humanity. All the prophets and messengers God have chosen. But some have very distinctive roles, and Muhammad has a very distinctive one. What's so distinctive about his role? He's the last one. And his revelation is believed by Muslims to be, as the final revelation, to be the clearest revelation. And the revelation from God that sums up and sheds light on the revelations given to all the other prophets and messengers of God that have come before him. So just as the tree gets its nourishment from the water of the lake, also photosynthesis is involved. That's why you have this association of Muhammad with the sun, the prophetic, if I can use the Christian term, the prophetic ministries of all of the prophets and messengers who have come before Muhammad are illuminated and vivified by the light that comes from his prophetic ministry. There's no real competition between them. You know, he's first among equals in the sense because he has this role to play confirming, as one famous verse in the Quran makes reference to, confirming the revelations of those who have gone before, particularly the revelation, as Muslims understand it, of the Injil, or the Gospel, to Jesus, and before him a Torah, or the Torah, to Musa, or Moses. Okay. So that's our window on prophetology. Now we're going to move to the window on theological anthropology. Okay, the window on theological anthropology. Has to do with the figures on this tree, beginning with Adam, going to the Enoch, Noah, Abraham, all of the ones that are named here, they're all Muslims. All the prophets and messengers of the tree are Muslims. How can this be? Wait a minute, I'm going to get even more provocative. The original religion of humankind is Islam. Some of you are sitting there saying, this guy has a PhD. You know, he's a historian of religions. He's just finished telling us that Muhammad was born in the late 6th century of the Common Era. You know, and we know that this great religious tradition known as Islam kind of came into being in the early 7th century. So it's completely ahistorical to talk about figures who, according to lore, lived long before that time as Muslims, and their religion, or the original religion of humankind, as Islam. The only reason I'm doing this is because this is the claim of the Quran, but it's not as illogical as you may think it is. It's not as ahistorical as you may think it is, as long as you interpret those terms in the lowercase. This is where the lowercase m is coming, and you notice the lowercase I for Islam. All right, Alexander, what do you mean by that? What is the difference between lowercase Islam, lowercase Muslim, and uppercase Islam, uppercase Muslim? What are you talking about? Well, first a note on Arabic orthography. There are no uppercase and lowercase letters in Arabic. This is a convention in other languages, like English. The Germans go crazy with it. They put all nouns in the uppercase, right? But what we do in English is we reserve the uppercase to designate a noun as having a proper sense, right? Referring to a specific instance of the generic type that's being referred to. So that's why the capitals are used for titles. If you say the president of the university, or the president, you know, of a particular country, without referring to the title, you use the lowercase, but if you're referring to the title as a specific individual, you use the uppercase. Proper nouns, this distinction between a proper noun and a generic use of a noun in Arabic is known only from the context. And here's the claim, and I think it's an accurate claim. In the Quran, when the words Islam and Muslim appear, and they don't appear all that often, by the way, but when the words Islam and Muslim appear, they appear as existential categories. They do not appear yet in the Quran as the proper nouns they've come to be, the name of a great world religion, i.e. Islam, and the proper name for those who practice that great world religion, i.e. Muslim. In the Quran, they don't have that sense. They have the sense of what they actually mean in Arabic as a general existential category. What do they mean? Islam means submission, and in the Quran it means submission to God. Muslim is the active participle from the same fourth form, increased form of the root, and Muslim means one who submits to God. So now I hope you're beginning to see how, from the Quranic perspective, it's quite logical to conceive of Adam as a Muslim and Islam as the original religion of humanity. Muhammad is not coming to bring a new religion to the world. He's being sent to call people back to their original religion. The religion practiced by Adam, the first human being, and practiced by all the prophets and messengers on the tree that we saw and that you still have in front of you on your handout. Only post-Quranically do these terms get reified. Islam and Muslim becomes Islam and Muslim in the capital sense. Why? Because as this community of faith that the Prophet Muhammad founds in Arabia in the 7th century begins to make its mark on the world, it's evident to the Muslims that if he's the last messenger, the best way that one can practice the original religion of humanity is to follow his example and to kind of practice submission to God the way he did and the way the community he founds does. So that's why in the religious imagination of most Muslims, the two senses of the generic existential sense of Islam and Muslim and the proper sense of Islam and Muslim are conflated. Okay? You following? No, you're not following? Okay, maybe we can get to it with the questions and answers. Now, what this means is, and the Quran teaches this, there's a Muslim in us all. There's an innate Muslim with a little m in every human being. There's a famous verse in the Quran, مَا كَانَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ يَهُودِيًّا وَلَا نَصْرَانِيًّا وَلَكِنْ كَانَ مُسْلِمًا حَنِيفًا وَمَا كَانَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian. He was a Muslim and a Hanif. That's Quran, Surah Al-Imran, verse 67. What's a Hanif? This is just a footnote here. Basically, someone who is able, like Abraham, to remain true to his or her inner submitter to the one true God, despite what might be the idolatrous nature of his or her environment. This perfectly describes Muhammad. As I said, he was depicted in the Muslim sources as a Jewish or Christian wannabe. He was raised in a largely pagan religious environment, but he didn't really want to have anything to do with paganism the same way Abraham. He had this innate sense that there was only one God, and he wanted to submit to that one God. So he wasn't corrupted by his environment in the way that many of us can be. This verse is interesting because I would contend that the Quran is well aware of the Christian-Jewish polemic over the figure of Abraham. Well aware, for instance, in the writings of St. Paul, there's kind of an attempt to say, if you don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, you're disinherited from the patrimony of Abraham. You become children of the slave woman Hagar, no longer children of the free woman of the covenant, Sarah. Why? Because God has come to offer a new covenant in Jesus of Nazareth. So the Quran is kind of aware that the Christians are kind of saying, if you were to reach into Abraham's Galabiya and pull out his wallet and look at his religious identity card, it had a big C on it for Christian. And you say, well, wait a minute, but Christianity in the time of Abraham, yeah, the proto-Christian. Abraham is the proto-Christian because he believes in God. He's justified before God because he believes that God is the God who can bring the living from the dead, the living child of Isaac from the dead womb of Sarah, and that's a prefigurement of faith in the resurrected Christ. That's the thinking of the Pauline tradition, right? But Jews are claiming, no, Jesus is not the Messiah, and Abraham is still our father in faith. And what's the Quran saying? The Quran saying, look, he doesn't belong to either of your religious clubs. He doesn't have a big J on his religious identity card. He doesn't have a big C on his religious identity card. And, this might be bad news for some Muslims in the room, I would say the Quran is saying he also doesn't have a big M on his religious identity card. He actually doesn't have a religious identity card. He is simply a Muslim. He is being true to his inner nature as a submitter to God. There's a hadith ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad, every human being is born a Muslim. It's her or his parents that Judaize, Christianize, or Zoroastrianize them. You could bring that up to date and say, secular humanize, agnosticize, whatever. Now, if we are to interpret Muslim in the writ large sense, this hadith makes no sense. There are many people in this room that were not born Muslims with a capital M. Right? But that's not what the hadith is saying. The hadith is saying, to use an IT metaphor, every human being is hardwired as a monotheist to submit their lives to the one true God. A lot of this goes back to a very mysterious verse in the Quran that alludes to an event known as the Yawm Alast. Yawm is Arabic, like Yom in Hebrew for day, and Alast means am I not? The day of am I not? And here's the verse in Surah 7. When your sustainer, and the S, by the way, means the singular you is being used, the PL means the plural you is being used. So God is speaking directly to the prophet here. When your sustainer drew forth from their loins the progeny of Adam, and made them testify on their own behalves in response to the question, Alastu birabbikum, am I not your sustainer? They said, Bala, shahidna. Yes, we bear witness. Lest you, humanity, should say on the day of resurrection, we had no idea. What is this about? Well, the Quranic commentators, and particularly the mystical commentators, like to delve deeply into this verse. They say, what this is about is a time before time. When God called into proto-existence all the human beings who would ever exist. That means every one of us in this room. All those who came before us. All those who will come after us. And we were all arrayed on a cosmic plane, called into proto-existence by our Creator. So that our Creator could ask us one question. Am I not your Creator, your Sustainer, your only God? And I just imagine this, yes, we bear witness, it's just us as being called into existence by our Creator saying, yes, you are. Yes, you are. And the verse goes on to explain why God is doing this. Right? Lest any of us should say on the day of resurrection, I had no idea. I had no idea that there was just one God and that I was created to serve that one God by serving my fellow human being. I had no inkling. How was I supposed to know? Well, the idea is it's deeply implanted in your spiritual DNA. And God's not just living up to your spiritual DNA. Don't worry. He sent all these prophets and messengers to remind you of what you said on the day of Alast. And to keep you faithful to the testimony you gave when you said, yes, you are our sustainer. Yes, you are our only God. The Yawm Alast is equated by the Sufis with the Yawm al-Mithaq, the day of the primordial covenant. The Yawm Alast is construed as this day when the human being is most her or himself. When we said in that dumbfounded, simple state, yes, you are our God, we had consciousness of nothing else but God. Probably even losing consciousness of our own individuated self. We didn't have our own individuated self for very long. And so the mystics like to talk about the quest to return in our spiritual life to the Yawm Alast, where our consciousness of God was so high and so intense. Because it's by developing that consciousness that we can truly live in to being created Muslim. This is an example, I like to show this example. It's an example of someone sitting in the julus position of salat, of the Muslim obligatory prayer, but the figure is made out of the words of the testimony of faith. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. So that the figure has become the testimony. You become what you say as a person of faith. In all of this, in opening this window on theological anthropology, we now come to the part where we can talk a little bit about how this teaches us about Islam's self-understanding vis-a-vis Judaism and Christianity. Well, human beings kind of have a fatal flaw. Maybe fatal is too strong. We can be heedless. Heedlessness, which is sometimes connected to forgetfulness. Right? We're sometimes very good at professing what our values and ideals are, but then when it comes to living up to them, we easily dismiss them or forget them. We like to ignore them because they become inconvenient. This heedlessness is known as ghafla. Jews and Christians, from the perspective of the Quran, are people who are heirs to the original teaching and truth about the original religion, about submitting to God. But from the Quranic perspective, as human beings are human beings, as time passes, there is corruption of the original message. So there are lots of different scholars, Muslim scholars, will talk about what that corruption involves. One point of corruption for the Jews is that they failed to recognize Jesus as a prophet and messenger of God. The central point of corruption from the Quranic perspective and from the perspective of many subsequent Muslim scholars of Christianity is that they deify Jesus and talk about God as a trinity of persons. Now, there's a lot that we can say about what the Quran is talking about when it's talking about the idea of Trinity and what Christians actually mean. Maybe Christians today, do they match? Is the Quran's critique of Trinitarianism a critique of a particular kind of Trinitarianism or all kinds of Trinitarianism? I mean, this is a very interesting subject for dialogue, and we've got, as long as God will give us before the Yom Adin, before the day of religion, we've got some time to maybe work through that as Muslims and Christians in dialogue together. But nonetheless, this is the standard understanding. This corruption has entered in. And so the Quran and Muhammad are the great reminders. The Arabic term here is dhikr. The great reminders of what true Islam, with a little I, true submission to God is. Calling each and every human being to be true to his or her Muslim nature. And thus, to become a Muslim with a capital M, for the reasons I alluded to earlier. That, it makes sense to follow the latest example. The clearest example of what it means to be faithful to one's inner Muslim. So from the Muslim perspective with a capital M, from the Muslim perspective with a capital I, the best way to go about being faithful to how God created you as a monotheist is to follow in the path of Muhammad, which then would mean you turn that little m Muslim into a capital M Muslim. And that little I, Islam, into a capital I, Islam. Okay, so that is basically my attempt at offering you an Islam 2.0, of opening the windows of Islamic prophetology and theological anthropology. And I hope it gives you something to chew on. I hope this is not an end so much as a beginning for many of you. Thank you so much.
We have some time for some questions.
Comments? Yes?
So how did you first become interested in religion?
In religion or in Islam?
Religion in general.
Well, I mean, I've always, I kind of raised as a Catholic, although my parents weren't actually observant Catholics, they didn't go to church. I think I've always felt the call of God in my life from which I was very, very young. And when I was a teenager, I thought I may have had a calling to the priesthood. And with some discernment, I realized I didn't. I had a calling to marry this young lady who was my high school sweetheart and now my wife of 30 years. I'm very happy I did that. But in that journey, when I was in college, I had already decided, because of the special role that my own faith was playing in my life, to study comparative religion. And I had my first course in Islam at about the same time that I was witnessing the events of the Iranian Revolution unfold. Now, for some of you in this room, most likely including the questioner, that was before you were born, but thanks to Ben Affleck, I can reference the movie Argo. So if for those of you that weren't alive in 1979, if you saw the movie Argo, it's talking about the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. And what I became fascinated with was the disconnect between what I was learning in my studies on Islam and the Introduction to Islam course that I was taking in the spring of 1980, as well as subsequent courses that I took in Muslim history and Islamic law and theology, etc., and the stereotypes, basically, that were the very negative stereotypes about Islam and Muslims that were being kind of perpetuated in the media. And so one thing led to another, and I became more and more fascinated. I kind of, in a way, fell in love intellectually and spiritually with the Islamic tradition. I became more fascinated with it, and then I thought that maybe my apostolate as a Catholic Christian was to be a kind of bridge builder, where I could help people in the West, particularly fellow Christians and Catholics, better understand their Muslim sisters and brothers. And so that's kind of been my ministry for the last 30 years. Yes?
Have you ever contemplated converting to Islam? Is there any reason you haven't? Or?
It's a great question. I don't hear the question about ever contemplated converting to Islam. It's a difficult question to answer because I've always felt, strongly attracted to Islam and the teachings of the Quran, but that attraction I at least identify as rooted in my commitment to Christ. There's nothing about Islam that would prevent me from becoming a Muslim. It's just that my entire passion for Islam and interest in Islam is I feel a call from Jesus Christ. And so my identity as a Christian and my interest in Islam are inseparable. And so, and now I can say that while I have never seriously considered converting to Islam, I have been converted by Islam and by Muslims time and time and time again in my life. Another way of putting this is, while I'm not a very good Christian, and certainly not a very good Catholic, I'm a much better one of both because of my experience with Islam and Muslims. This is the great mystery of interreligious dialogue. That if you're rooted in your faith tradition, the experience of another's experience of God doesn't weaken your faith. It makes your faith better, and it makes you better at living that faith. I'll give you one concrete example of this. So, as you know, observant Muslims pray 5 times a day. They really understand the importance of prayer. The importance of making life prayer. The Quran, there's an imperative verse in the Quran, اذكر الله ذكرا كثيرا. Recollect God frequently. It's a direct parallel to me of St. Paul's pray unceasingly. Right? Devote all your life to God. I'm witnessing, my Muslim sisters and brothers stopping 5 times a day to pray. And I'm saying to myself, gee, my prayer life pales by comparison. And I learned, though, somewhere I guess I knew about the Liturgy of the Hours, which is a tradition in Catholicism of praying 7 times a day. Thing is, in Catholicism, the only people that are vowed to do that are people that take special vows. Religious people, priests, and religious men and women who take special vows to say those prayers every day. I have a Muslim friend that likes to say that, yes, what the Prophet Muhammad did is what it brought monasticism to the masses. I like that notion. But what I experienced was what Bishop Christopher Stendhal calls holy envy. I saw this prayer life of my Muslim sisters and brothers, and I wanted this for myself in some way. But I didn't have to become a Muslim to have that. There was something in my tradition that offered me that opportunity. But that praying of the Liturgy of the Hours, which I do very irregularly and not faithfully at all, let me just be on record with that, but that praying of the Liturgy of the Hours is a gift to me from Muslims. Muslims have gifted me with this very important treasure in my own faith. And I'll be ever grateful and thus converted by Islam in that very important aspect of my own faith life. Yes, sir.
I apologize for how this will sound crude, but it seems to me that Abraham has been hijacked.
Hijacked?
Yes.
Yeah. By the Quran, you mean? Well, I would agree with you. Abraham, I'm not going to say the Quran hijacks Abraham. I'm not going to. But the thing is, now his name is escaping me. John Levinson. John Levinson of Harvard has a new book, and I should know the title. Anyone here know the title? Abraham's in the title. Okay, Levinson is Levenson. And what John is talking about in that book is not Abraham as a figure that unites Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but as a figure that divides Jews, Christians, and Muslims, because so much of the forging of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim identity is fighting over Abraham. So you can indeed say, from an analytical perspective, it looks like the Quran is just, kind of taking Abraham, and appropriating Abraham to create a new religious identity. Well, in a sense, the Quran doesn't understand itself to be doing that, right? Because it's saying it's the original religion, etc. But, that's how the tradition in some ways interprets it. But St. Paul does the same thing. So you can legitimately point the finger at the Quran, but you've also got to point the finger at St. Paul. Because he's basically saying Abraham was a proto-Christian. And unless you accept Jesus as the Messiah, you're not being faithful to the Abrahamic patrimony. De facto disinheriting Jews, in a way, his fellow Jews, from full participation in the patrimony of Abraham. So, yeah, it's kind of like, show me your Abraham and I'll tell you who you are. Right? That's what it is. And listen, you can say the same thing about Jesus. You can say, in terms of intra-Christian diversity, you can say, those Seventh-day Adventists, they hijack Jesus. Or, the Baptists can say, those Catholics, the evangelicals will say, those Catholics hijack Jesus. They took Jesus and turned him into something, and they have all these sacraments and everything like this, but we know who Jesus really is. So that hijacking, right, is a standard feature of religions, as religious traditions, as they define themselves, over and against existing traditions. Thanks for that. Way in the back.
What do you think would happen to you if you lived during the Inquisition?
Wouldn't be.
What would happen to me if I lived during the Inquisition? I don't know. I don't think it's a great question, right? But because it sort of makes you think of time travel. So, like, I forget what was that series where the people went in a tunnel and they were I forget what that was called, right? Stargate. Or the time. Yeah. So I guess if I were transported back at the time of the Inquisition, a lot of bad things would happen to me. First of all, I don't speak any Spanish, so no one would know what I was talking about. But those who spoke my kind of English or understood me. What I mean to say is I'm a product of my age and generation. So it's hard to imagine in so many different ways how I would possibly fit in to what would be for me a completely alien historical and cultural context. But I think I know what you're saying.
I guess to put it another way,
Yeah.
did the Catholic Church never see the Muslim religion?
Good question. Yeah, that's good question. So this lecture was not about. This lecture obviously was not about Catholic perspectives on Islam. I mean, I'm a Catholic, right? But I'm trained in Islamic studies. I'm doing Islam 2.0. I'm trying to introduce an audience to certain salient features of the Muslim worldview. The history of Catholic-Muslim relations is quite different. I am the heir, in my own school, in my own time, to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council about interreligious relations, and particularly the document Nostra Aetate, which actually represents an important shift in emphasis. I'll briefly summarize what that is. For centuries, all the way back to the patristic period, there were Christian thinkers who talked about concepts like logos spermatikos, that there were the seeds of the word, that all the religions of humanity were preparations for receiving the gospel. that they were all ways of people striving to relate to God and being prepared for the revelation in Jesus Christ. But the dominant tradition that sort of took over in terms of not just Catholic, but general Christian teaching about other religions is they're wrong and demonic and they lead you to hell. So whatever you do, I mean, not just other religions, but other forms of Christianity. When my parents were being raised as Catholics in the 1950s, they were told they couldn't go to Protestant weddings. You know, they couldn't go to the weddings of their Protestant friends because somehow they would be corrupted and it's a sin and you'll go to hell if you go to a Protestant wedding. What Nostra Aetate did in the Second Vatican Council, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council now, what Nostra Aetate did was it kind of turned down the volume on that exclusivist approach that saw other religions as negative. In fact, it kind of shut that off entirely and said, no, the early fathers were right. All religions of humanity, in one way or another, are ways in which human beings are trying to connect with their Creator. So what we need to do as Catholics is recognize what is true and holy, the document says. In fact, it says the Catholic Church affirms what is true and holy in other religions. Now, it doesn't say what is true and holy in other religions, but I like that because it's kind of an invitation to Catholics to explore the faiths of others and to discern what is true and holy in the faith of others. And I like to think, in part, so one can understand more deeply the mysteries of our own Christian faith. But that's a kind of fairly, I mean, it's rooted in some old teachings, but it's a kind of fairly new emphasis that's been around since the Second Vatican Council. I don't think I would be teaching as an Islamicist at a Catholic institution, even though I'm Catholic. I don't think there'd be a Catholic Muslim Studies program, or a Catholic Jewish Studies program for that matter, were it not for the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate. Thank you for that question. We have time for one more? One more, right here.
Well, I want to apologize for making this statement, just like that gentleman did right there, because it's not my statement. But I'd like to, but this is what if I were to talk to some of my friends who are bigoted as far as religion goes, and I would stick up for Islam, which I'm not a Muslim. The statement would be this: I would say to them, well, look at. There's only one God, and your God and their God is the same God. It's the God of Abraham. Now, their answer to me would be this. They would say, you are wrong. Their God and our God is different. Here's what the difference is between their God and our God. Our God died for us. Their God asked to kill for them.
Yeah, that's Boykin. That's General Boykin. Remember General Boykin?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he said. He, as our troops are fighting in Muslim countries, he actually said the difference between the Christian God and the Muslim God is the Christian God sent his son to die for us. They send their sons to kill for their God. I mean, that is the classic example of comparing my best with your worst. Classic example. My Mother Teresa, your Adolf Hitler. My Harvard University, your, closing community college that's not accredited, You see this in all forms of racism, ethnic antagonism. It's always what's great about the Irish, what's bad about the Italians. That's what we do as human beings. So, I mean, there's no Muslim that understands their faith in that caricature. So it's an imbalance. All Christians understand God to have sent God's Word incarnate to die for the sins of humanity. That's right. That's a Christian self-understanding. But now let's compare that with a Muslim self-understanding. That's the fair comparison. But what we're comparing is a Christian self-understanding with a self-serving Christian understanding of Islam. Easy to make the other seem demonic and to ostracize the other and to devalue the faith of the other. No Muslim understands, and insofar as we witness, young people blowing themselves up in some deluded notion that they're being faithful to Islam, most Muslims would not see that as a legitimate act in Islam. And, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of fatwas that have been written. In fact, Dr. Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri, who's the leader of a very influential South Asian Muslim movement called Minhaj al-Quran, has written a 650-page fatwa condemning terrorism and suicide bombing. And, you know, he's received death threats, you know, by extremists, you know, for that. Fatullah Gulen, who leads a global Muslim spiritual renewal and revival movement, has said similar things, as do many Muslim clerics. But, you know, there's a lot of politics involved here. And I think in some ways, too, it's very difficult to talk objectively about Islam in the current global political context because Islamic identity is being used politically. First and foremost by Muslim radicals who are saying we are doing what we're doing in the name of Islam. And they get heard, that perspective gets heard. Why? Because they're blowing things up. And when you blow things up, you get heard and your perspective gets heard. That's the reason why you hear that perspective and you don't know about Dr. Muhammad Tahir al-Qadri and his fatwa. Because he's not blowing things up. He's writing books, you know, about how this is un-Islamic. But I just basically return, I would say to your friends, let's be careful because that caricature of Islam, they send their sons to die for God, is a negative caricature of Muslims that would not reflect how Muslims see themselves and how they understand their faith. So insofar as you're comfortable comparing positive understandings of your own faith with your own negative understandings of faiths of others, I suppose you can do that. But it's not very fair or valuable, and it will never lead to mutual understanding.
Let me first invite you back tomorrow evening. The lecture tomorrow evening is Islam and Muslims in the Domestic and International Context, Moving Beyond Media Soundbites, which is probably where we just left off.
Exactly.
So come back and hear more of that, and let's join in thanking again Dr. Alexander.